You are under arrest. Put your hands behind your back now.
In this courtroom, you're nothing but a defendant in disguise, one officer sneered before slapping her across the face, the crack of skin against skin echoing through the chamber. The room went still. Gasps rose from the benches, followed by a ripple of nervous laughter. Phones shot up, screens glowing as the moment was captured. The two officers swaggered with the kind of arrogance only power without restraint can breed. Their uniforms gleamed, their holsters heavy with symbols of authority. To them, the courtroom wasn't a house of justice. It was their stage. They had made a habit of flexing their control, mocking those they deemed weak, knowing that in most cases no one would dare challenge them. Their badges were their crowns, and cruelty was their language. And today they had chosen their target, a black woman seated quietly in the gallery. She wore plain clothes, her hair pulled back neatly, her hands folded calmly in her lap. To anyone glancing her way, she was unremarkable, just another face in the crowd. But her posture carried a quiet dignity, her gaze steady even as she became the center of attention. The officers saw none of that. To them, she was just another voice to silence, another body to humiliate. You think you can disrupt proceedings? The taller one spat, his words sharp as knives. You don't speak unless spoken to. The other joined in, smirking as he stepped closer. This isn't your place. You don't belong here. Then came the slap. Deliberate, calculated, meant not just to sting but to strip her of dignity in front of everyone. The sound rang louder than the gavel ever had. The gallery buzzed, half the room horrified, the other half frozen in the uneasy spectacle. Some laughed nervously, hiding their discomfort and cruelty. Others whispered, their eyes darting between the woman's composed face and the officer's sneering confidence. Phones captured it all. The slap, the mockery, the silence that followed. And yet she did not flinch. Her calm remained unshaken, her dignity untouched. Where most would cry out or shrink back, she sat taller, her gaze steady, her silence heavier than their insults. The judge on the bench banged the gavel for order, but the tension clung to the air like smoke. The officers stood smirking, convinced they had reminded her of her place, but they had no idea. The narrator's voice cut through, ominous and sharp. They thought it was just another display of authority, but in seconds their arrogance would collapse, because the woman they struck was not a defendant at all. She was the judge about to take the bench. She had been underestimated all her life. Born into poverty, raised by a single mother in a neighborhood where opportunity seemed to belong to someone else, she grew up knowing what it felt like to be invisible. School books were borrowed, sometimes passed down so many times that the covers peeled off and the pages tore at the edges. Lights flickered in the small apartment she shared with her mother and younger brother, and on nights when the power cut out, she studied by the dim glow of candles. By day, she took shifts at corner stores, diners, and laundromats to keep her family afloat. By night, she drowned herself in textbooks, teaching herself not only the curriculum but everything she could find on law, history, and the principles of justice. Her classmates saw only the quiet girl in the back, but her notebooks were filled with arguments, case studies, and visions of a future no one else imagined for her. Her grandmother, who raised her mother before her, often sat with her in those late hours. The old woman's voice carried the weight of experience and survival. Power is loud, but dignity is patient, she would say, brushing a hand across her granddaughter's shoulder. And patience always wins. Those words became her anchor, her compass, a mantra whispered to herself in moments when the world pressed down too heavily. Unlike many of her peers, her dream was never about wealth or status. She didn't fantasize about mansions or cars. What she wanted was justice, a chance to shift the scales for those who, like her, had grown up believing the system was designed against them. She wanted the truth to matter. She wanted fairness to be more than an idea written on paper. Through sheer grit, she clawed her way into college, working days and studying nights, often running on 3 hours of sleep. Professors soon recognized her brilliance, her ability to dismantle arguments with precision, her fierce clarity in debate. She applied to law school on scholarships and loans, stepping onto a campus where most students had parents who were judges, attorneys, or CEOs. They looked at her plain clothes and quiet demeanor and assumed she was a charity case, a filler student. They never guessed she would rise to the top of her class. She did more than graduate. She excelled. Her name became whispered in law circles not because she was loud or flashy, but because she was relentless, thorough, and fair. Judges respected her. Attorneys feared her. Clients trusted her, and yet she never shed her humility. She never forgot where she came from. She never forgot the sight of her mother's tired hands washing uniforms late into the night, or the sound of her grandmother's mantra spoken in a trembling but steady voice. Those memories were her foundation, and they kept her rooted as she built a career that none of her childhood neighbors would have thought possible. Meanwhile, the officers who would one day cross her path lived in a very different world. They wore their uniforms like crowns, moving through courtrooms and streets with unchecked authority. In their eyes, the badge was not just responsibility, it was entitlement. They thrived on intimidation, feeding on the fear in people's eyes, mistaking silence for submission. Every day in court, they strutted as though they owned the room, certain that no one would dare question them. For them, the courtroom wasn't sacred ground. It was their stage. These were men accustomed to writing the script, confident the audience would always play along. They mocked defendants, smirked at family members in the gallery, barked orders at attorneys who had no choice but to comply. Their arrogance had grown so absolute that they no longer distinguished between law and theater. To them, the slap of a hand, the slam of a door, the sneer of an insult, these were all instruments of control. They didn't know that on the day they turned that cruelty toward a quiet black woman in plain clothes, they weren't just humiliating another bystander, they were exposing themselves, because the woman they struck wasn't invisible. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't voiceless. She was the one who carried the authority they had pretended to own. She was the judge who would soon take the bench, the gavel in her hand, their arrogance under her scrutiny. They thought they were humiliating a bystander, the narrator reflects. But in truth, they were exposing themselves to the very gavel she would soon raise. The echo of the slap still lingered in the courtroom, its sting sharper in the silence that followed than on the woman's skin. The officers leaned back with smirks, their confidence swelling under the eyes of the gallery. They believed they had reminded her of her place. "You don't belong in rooms like this," the taller one sneered, his voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. He circled her like a predator, puffing his chest. "Courtrooms are for law, for authority. People like you," he flicked his hand dismissively, "you just take up space." The other officer chuckled, his laugh bouncing off the wooden walls. Probably wandered in thinking this was a free show. Some people will do anything for attention. He looked her up and down as though she were less than human, shaking his head. "She doesn't belong here." The words were meant to slice, but she didn't flinch. She sat upright, shoulders squared, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her silence unnerved more than any retort could. A man in the gallery let out a stifled laugh, the kind that covers discomfort with cruelty. A few others joined, uneasy chuckles rolling like pebbles across stone. But not everyone laughed. Some leaned forward, studying the woman's face, noticing the calmness that clung to her like armor. "Why isn't she reacting?" Someone whispered near the back. "Most people would be yelling by now." "She looks too calm," another replied, their brow furrowed. "Like she knows something we don't." The officers either didn't notice or didn't care. They pressed on, their mockery escalating. "Go on, say something," the first officer taunted, lowering his face close to hers. "Oh, right, you're too scared." The second officer clapped his hands theatrically, drawing out nervous laughter from a few in the room. "Maybe she doesn't understand how the court works. This isn't a playground, sweetheart. This is serious business." Her eyes shifted, just slightly, locking onto his. She didn't blink, didn't break. The officer faltered for a fraction of a second before recovering, his smirk returning but thinner than before. A clerk at her desk scribbled notes, her pen pausing as she studied the scene. Her lips barely moved, but those near her heard the whisper, "Careful." Sometimes the quiet ones surprise you. The gallery rustled again. Some people exchanged looks. The slap had felt like a spectacle, the kind that people watch with nervous curiosity. But the longer the woman stayed silent, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't resignation, it was patience, and that realization began to creep into the minds of those watching. The officers grew frustrated. Their taunts grew sharper, more personal. "Maybe she's here looking for a handout," one said, his voice laced with disdain. "Always the same story. They think they deserve a seat at the table, but they've never earned it." "Look at her," the other added, his tone dripping with contempt. "Plain clothes, no authority, no reason to be here. She doesn't even belong on the sidewalk outside this building, let alone inside." Another laugh escaped from the crowd, but this time it was softer, hesitant. The balance of the room was shifting. Some people were beginning to feel uneasy with the spectacle, the cruelty too obvious, the woman's composure too unsettling. Still, she didn't move. Her stillness was like a stone in a rushing river, unyielding no matter how hard the current pushed. Every insult thrown at her seemed to bounce off, landing back on the men who hurled them. The officers puffed themselves up further, mistaking silence for surrender. They strutted, making a show of their authority. "See?" one announced, gesturing broadly to the gallery. "She knows her place. Quiet, obedient. That's how it should be." But his words didn't carry the same weight they had moments earlier. The audience was no longer unified in nervous laughter. The room was splitting. Some shifted uncomfortably, whispering their doubts. A few eyes narrowed on the officers with quiet judgment. Others turned their attention to the woman, studying her more closely, sensing that her silence was not weakness but warning. "Why isn't she saying anything?" another voice asked. "It's almost like she's waiting." The clerk glanced up again, her whisper now slightly louder. "Patience always wins." The officers ignored her. They continued to posture, unaware that the ground beneath them was beginning to crack. They thought they were writing the script, but the woman's silence was rewriting it in real time. Every second she remained composed. Every insult she refused to acknowledge, the room's energy tilted further away from them. The officers had turned their authority into theater, but their performance was starting to lose its audience. She sat unmoved, steady as stone, letting them dig their own graves with every word. The gavel cracked against the sound block, sharp as thunder, and the presiding judge adjusted his glasses. The gallery quieted, but tension lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The officers still smirked, confident they had secured the room, convinced the silence of their victim meant defeat. "Court will now move into the next session," the presiding judge announced, his voice firm but oddly measured. He glanced toward the gallery, his eyes locking for a brief moment on the woman who had endured every insult without breaking. Then, in a move no one expected, he stood from his chair. "The bench is now transferred," he said simply before stepping aside. Gasps cracked across the gallery like lightning. Murmurs rippled, heads turned, and cameras lifted higher. Because the woman who had sat silently through their mockery, the one they had slapped and dismissed as nothing, now rose. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one ringing louder than the officers' laughter had minutes before. She walked past them, her chin high, her calm unshaken. The officers froze, their faces draining of color as she passed. The smirks collapsed, replaced by shock, then horror. Their eyes darted toward one another, searching for answers, for an escape, but finding none. She reached the bench. A clerk approached her with reverence, handing over the black robe that carried not only fabric but centuries of authority. She slid into it with quiet dignity, fastening the collar with hands that did not tremble. Then she took the seat, the highest in the room, the one meant for truth and judgment. The explosion of realization thundered through the courtroom. Phones recorded every second, their red dots glowing like witnesses to history. Gasps turned to roars of disbelief. Whispers became a storm. "She's the judge. Oh my God, she's the judge." They slapped a judge. The officers stumbled backward, the weight of their arrogance crashing down on them. Sweat glistened at their temples. Their mouths opened, but no sound came. They had mocked her, degraded her, struck her, and now the truth stood undeniable. They had humiliated the very person sworn to decide their fate. The woman, now judge, lifted the reports they had written, the flimsy shields they thought would protect their actions. Her voice, calm but resonant, filled the chamber. "According to this account," she began, "I disrupted proceedings. I disrespected officers of the court. I resisted authority." She paused, her eyes scanning the room, letting the words hang in the silence. "Let us examine the truth, one by one." She tore through their lies. "You wrote that I raised my voice," she said, holding up the first report. "Yet the video shows I said nothing at all. Not one word. The only raised voices were yours." She lifted the second page. "You wrote that I resisted. But here," she gestured to the evidence screen, where a bystander's video replayed her stillness as they shoved her, "you will see no movement. No aggression. Only patience met with violence." Her gaze cut to the officers, sharp enough to pierce armor. They shifted, their faces pale, unable to speak. The gallery murmured louder, gasps colliding with whispers of outrage. Phones zoomed closer, documenting every contradiction she revealed. "And this line," she continued, tapping the page, "where you claim I disrupted the dignity of the courtroom? Tell me, gentlemen, what is more disruptive to dignity? Silence or a hand raised against it?" Applause burst from the back rows, stifled quickly by the gavel but impossible to silence completely. The officers shrank lower in their seats, stripped of the confidence that had once cloaked them. She set the reports down, her robe settling around her like armor. "Your words were false. Your actions were reckless. And your arrogance has brought shame not to me, but to this institution you were sworn to protect." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, no longer able to contain itself. Cheers mingled with shouts of "yes" and "that's justice." The officers stammered, their mouths opening, but the words tangled, incoherent. Their power had evaporated in front of hundreds of eyes. She raised a hand, and the noise ebbed. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Justice doesn't bow to uniforms," she said, each word deliberate, unflinching. "It bows to truth." The symbolic line hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. It was more than a statement. It was a verdict, carved into the memory of everyone in that room. The officers looked shattered. The slap they had delivered, once a show of dominance, was now their undoing, because every phone in the room had captured it. Every screen replayed the sound, the sight, the arrogance. And now, played beside the truth of her role, it became evidence, not of her humiliation, but of their downfall. The final blow landed not from her hand, but from the roar of the people. The gallery rose, applause crashing like waves against stone. Some cheered. Others wept openly. The officers, drowning in the storm of their own making, sat motionless, their careers, reputations, and arrogance collapsing in real time. The judge leaned forward, her gaze steady, her words calm but final. "You thought you owned this courtroom, but today the courtroom owns the truth. And the truth is this: dignity cannot be slapped away." The gavel struck. The sound was thunderous, sealing the moment not as spectacle, but as history. Phones recorded as the officers were led out, their heads bowed, their swagger erased. The images would travel beyond these walls, onto screens, into headlines, across nations. The slap they had intended as humiliation would live forever, but not in the way they imagined. It would replay as the evidence of their arrogance, the spark of their collapse, and the crown of her rise. The woman they struck had risen higher than they could ever reach, and the entire world had watched them fall. The gavel's echo still lingered when the bailiffs stepped forward, their faces stern and unyielding. Without hesitation, they flanked the two officers, their swagger now completely gone. The gallery fell into a hush, every eye fixed on the men who had strutted minutes earlier with unchecked arrogance. "Remove them," the judge ordered simply, her voice steady but resonant with finality. The command carried no malice, only authority, the kind of authority the officers had pretended to own but never truly possessed. The men stumbled as they were guided out, their protests weak, their voices cracking under the weight of shame. Phones tracked their every step, capturing the bowed heads, the sweat-drenched brows, the collapse of reputations once inflated by arrogance. Whispers followed them like shadows. "Did you see their faces? They slapped a judge. Their careers are finished." Each phrase clung to them like chains, louder than the sound of the doors closing behind them. In that instant, the respect they had demanded for years dissolved into nothing. What lingered was disgrace. Inside the courtroom, a different energy bloomed. People began to clap again, the sound cautious at first, then swelling into thunderous applause. Attorneys stood. Clerks smiled through tears. Spectators raised their phones higher, determined to capture not only the downfall but the dignity that had risen in its place. For the woman on the bench, the moment was not triumph, but truth. She had not shouted. She had not retaliated. She had simply revealed the power of patience, the inevitability of justice, and the world had witnessed it. Legal peers would later describe it as one of the most extraordinary reversals in courtroom history, not because laws were rewritten, but because dignity had been elevated so visibly, so undeniably, in the very room built to protect it. Judges from other districts called to express admiration. Lawyers who had once underestimated her sent messages of respect. Activists flooded the courthouse steps, chanting her name alongside words like grace, truth, and justice. By evening, the story had already escaped the courthouse walls. Headlines blazed across websites. Officers slap woman in court. Seconds later, she takes the bench. Justice served. Judge reveals truth after public humiliation. Clips spread like wildfire. In one video, the slap replayed over and over, followed by the gasp of realization as she donned the robe. Another video showed her tearing through their false reports, her calm words slicing sharper than any gavel. Millions watched within hours and hashtags surged across platforms. Justice rose, truth on the bench, dignity wins. And while the world debated, dissected, and celebrated, she picked up her phone to call home. Her mother answered, her voice weary but warm. "Hi, Mama," she began softly, her composure cracking just a little. "I saw it," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. "Everyone's talking about it. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," the judge said, though her throat tightened. "It was intense, but it's over now." There was a pause, and then her mother's voice, thick with emotion. "You didn't just take the bench today. You made justice rise with you." Tears blurred her vision, but she smiled. "Thank you, Mama. I remembered what Grandma used to say." Her mother finished the mantra with her. "Power is loud, but dignity is patient. And patience always wins." The two women sat in silence for a long moment. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but full, of pride, of relief, of legacy fulfilled. Meanwhile, the officer's downfall unfolded at the speed of the internet. Their names, once associated with authority, became synonymous with arrogance undone. The slap they had delivered became a meme, a cautionary tale, a rallying cry. Their reports, filled with contradictions, were dissected online by lawyers and laypeople alike. Every lie was exposed. Every ounce of their false authority burned under the glare of public scrutiny. Colleagues distanced themselves. Fellow officers avoided defending them, aware the tide of public opinion was irreversible. Even their own department released a statement within 24 hours. "We are aware of the incident. We do not condone misconduct. Investigations are underway, but the world already knew. Investigations or not, the verdict had been delivered. By truth, by dignity, by the eyes of millions." Back in her chambers, the judge sat quietly after her mother hung up. She looked at the robe folded neatly across the chair, the symbol of authority she had earned not by arrogance but by resilience. She thought of the slap, the sting still faint on her cheek, and realized it was no longer a wound but a seal, a mark of patience's victory. The courtroom had seen her humiliation, but it had also seen her rise, and in that rise, the balance of power had shifted forever. The shock of that day didn't stay confined to the four walls of the courtroom. It spilled outward, first through whispers, then through headlines, and finally into a global conversation. What had begun as humiliation transformed into legacy. For the judge, the experience became more than just a personal victory. It was a catalyst. She understood the symbolic weight of what had happened. Millions had seen a black woman, silenced and struck, rise above cruelty and reclaim dignity without a raised voice or a clenched fist. It was more than justice served. It was justice revealed. She didn't let the moment fade into a viral headline. Instead, she seized it as an opportunity to enact change. Within months, she launched a court transparency initiative, ensuring that all proceedings in her jurisdiction would be open to greater public scrutiny. Reports were digitized, recordings archived, and accountability strengthened so no one could manipulate the truth as the officers had tried to do. She also established a mentorship program for women in law, especially for women of color who, like her, had grown up hearing they didn't belong in rooms of power. Law students were paired with seasoned judges and attorneys, creating a network of support where silence and invisibility were replaced by encouragement and visibility. If dignity can rise from silence, she told them, then let it roar when you stand for others. Her advocacy reached beyond the legal profession. Partnering with grassroots organizations, she created programs to amplify marginalized voices silenced in courtrooms, victims, families, and defendants who too often had been dismissed or ignored. For her, the slap was no longer a wound. It was a reminder that arrogance thrives in silence, and that silence, when turned into action, could roar louder than arrogance ever imagined. Meanwhile, the officers who had once strutted in uniforms found themselves stripped of everything. At first, they were suspended pending investigation. But the footage was undeniable, their false reports shredded in the public eye. The slap they had thought would go unnoticed was now replayed on news stations and social media loops around the globe. Within weeks, both men were fired, their names added to a growing list of disgraced officials whose careers collapsed under the weight of arrogance. Their faces became symbols, not of authority, but of its abuse. No defense they offered could erase the evidence of their downfall. They weren't remembered for years of service, but for seconds of cruelty. Colleagues turned away. Old friends distanced themselves, and the world remembered them only for one thing: the slap that destroyed their careers. The courthouse, too, could not escape scrutiny. Public trust had been shaken, and something had to change. Under mounting pressure from activists, legal experts, and the judge herself, the institution implemented strict reforms against officer misconduct. New oversight committees were created. Independent public accountability boards were formed, with the power to review officer behavior and issue sanctions. Training programs on implicit bias, restraint, and dignity were made mandatory. Signs were posted in courtrooms. Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of justice. For the first time in years, communities began to feel the courtroom wasn't just a place where dignity was stripped, but where it could be restored. The viral impact could not be contained. Clips of the incident circulated across continents, translated into dozens of languages, shared with captions that turned the story into a universal lesson. Hashtags surged. Mass justice rose. Dignity on the bench. Slap backfired. Memes spread, but so did essays, think pieces, and sermons. Millions found inspiration in her calm defiance. Young women posted videos of themselves studying with captions like, "One day, I'll sit at the bench too." Parents used her story as a lesson for children about patience, resilience, and dignity. Civil rights leaders praised her as proof that arrogance, no matter how loud, collapses in the face of truth. For the judge herself, the fame was secondary. She remained focused on the work, on turning that one moment into a movement that would outlive her. Yet she could not deny the power of what had unfolded. A single slap had echoed around the world. But louder still was the sound that followed. The roar of dignity, unshaken, undeniable, rising to its rightful place. They slapped her in a courtroom, forgetting justice doesn't kneel to arrogance. They mocked her, struck her, tried to reduce her to silence in the very place where truth is meant to reign. But in seconds, their power collapsed, and her dignity rose higher than the bench itself. What the world saw that day was not just humiliation turned on its head, but the deeper truth that cannot be hidden. Patience carries more weight than cruelty, and dignity outlasts every attempt to destroy it. She proved that justice is not fragile, not something uniforms or arrogance can bend. Justice, when held in steady hands, becomes a shield for the voiceless and a mirror that exposes the corrupt. Her story leaves us with a lesson we cannot forget. True power, knowledge. True wealth, humility. True downfall, arrogance unmasked. She did not need to shout. She did not need to strike back. Her silence roared, and her rise reminded the world that justice belongs to no one's fists, only to the truth. If you believe dignity can't be silenced, not by uniforms, not by arrogance, not by violence, share this story. Let the world see, justice always finds her seat.